So today we're going to be talking about chapter 6, section 4, which is just called The Fall of the Roman Empire. And if you want to follow along in your notes, I just handed you a copy, so you'll find chapter 6, section 4 in there as well. So we're going to start with the economy. So I'm going to make the argument that economic problems and political instability are two of the most common factors that will destroy a country. And we're going to start with the economy. But first off, Rome became an empire. It began as a republic. It became an empire. And the first of the 5 emperors were actually pretty good. Now, good in the sense that they thought I want to qualify. They thought they were gods. They punished anyone who didn't agree with them, and they ruled with an iron fist. They were tyrants in every sense of the word. But people had jobs. The crime rate was low. Commerce was growing, and they seemed to be winning wars. And people will put up with a lot, and people will often, sadly enough, give up many of their freedoms in exchange for economic stability. And so that's why the first of the 5 emperors were called the, quote, good emperors. They never stood for a democratic election. They ruled with absolute power. They could kill anybody they wanted to for any reason. However, the reason they're called the 5 good emperors is because they effectively administered their empire. And it was a peaceful time in Rome's history called the Pax Romana. And that just means the peace of Rome. The last of the 5 good emperors was a man named Marcus Aurelius. And he's often considered the philosopher king. And really, if you were ever reading Plato's Republic, and he talked about how great it would be if there was a king that was also a philosopher, that was also a good person, that was wise and beneficent. And I think Marcus Aurelius fits that description about as well as anyone in history. But when he died, and his son Commodus took the throne, it began a slow decline of bad emperor to worse emperor, leading to so many problems. Now, the first of the economic problems we see is that keeping highways and trade routes open and safe requires a strong military presence. It requires an effective administrator, meaning if pirates attack a caravan and get away with it, and the next group of pirates attack a caravan and get away with it, then how are you going to have caravans? And if you can't have caravans, you can't have things coming in from other places. And if pirates are attacking ships at sea and they go unanswered, then you're going to have lots of pirates on the sea. You're going to have lots of pirates on the land. And then how do you get trade? And so because of these hostile tribes, nomadic groups, for whatever reasons, were attacking trade routes. Why? Because these trade routes are bringing wealthy goods. And if you can rob a train and get away with it, boom, you're super rich. So how did they fix this? How did those 5 good emperors fix this problem? They didn't. Well, no, they had forts along every stopping point. Think of like exits on the interstate. And so they had state troopers, if you will, soldiers manning these forts. And they kept the roads patrolled. They had a strong navy that kept the sea routes patrolled and safe. But because trade grew to be disrupted, then the price of things went up. Because there was a supply chain crisis, the price of things started to go up. And what does that mean? That means inflation, that the value of actual money goes down. So there's a couple other problems. Yeah, I mean, in all seriousness, like some of this you can see echoing in our world today. A couple other problems. if you can't bring in food, then you've got to be able to produce it all on your own. And if you're going to have to produce more food, if an area is going to have to begin producing more food than what it normally would, the soil is going to become overworked. And if you overwork the soil, the nutrients will deplete and it will stop growing things. This is the simplest answer and explanation for the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. Yeah, so because the price of food went down, farmers were having to overproduce, and because they were overproducing, they were exhausting the land, and much of the Great Plains turned into a desert temporarily. So, a few causes to get us going. Secondly, the military. A lot of the stability of a country depends on its police and military. You know, most people will obey the laws because they're good people. But we still have to have the laws. We still have to have the police and the military because we also know that some people just aren't. And some people will do bad things unless there's a police and a military. And by the 3rd century of the Common Era, the Roman military was in trouble. Soldiers were more loyal to their generals than they were to the entire empire. This gave generals an awful large amount of power. In fact, the Roman military was becoming less centralized. Instead of all these Roman generals answering directly to the emperor, they're kind of doing their own thing in different parts of the Roman Empire. Meanwhile, because of a shortage of soldiers, the Romans were often having to rely on contracting agencies, mercenaries for hire. By the end of the Afghan and Iraq wars in recent American history, we were relying to an increasing amount on mercenaries. That is, not American soldiers, but actually contractors were doing a lot of the work of the American soldiers in both countries. And this is exactly what was happening in Rome. Because of a shortage of Roman soldiers, they began to hire outside agencies. And that gives a lot of power to some contractors. Meanwhile, What else did we notice about Rome that's really scary? Look at the bottom bullet. The interest level of the common person went down. How can this be measured? Well, Rome wasn't a democracy. But in a democracy, this can be measured by the voter turnout. When voter turnout is low, that is one way to quantify low interest. So when the average citizen began to lose interest in the affairs of Rome, it's not a good sign. Now, it's not to say that every emperor after Marcus Aurelius was bad. His son was terrible. Commodus, if you ever want to look him up, there are some crazy stories about him. For one, he's famous for being the only emperor I know of that actually fought in the Colosseum. Yeah, he was an emperor, and he would put on a suit pretending to be a giant, and he would fight prisoners dressed up as monsters. He thought he was some descendant of Hercules, and so he would dress up like Hercules, and then they would make the prisoners dress up like monsters, but they would give the monsters fake weapons, and then he would go through killing them all. The guy was nuts. And anyway, there's actually a movie about it called The Gladiator, and we've watched some clips of it. It's a lot of fun. But that's not exactly what you want in an administrator, someone who kills people for fun. There are some messed up stories about these late emperors, but there were some wise ones. For example, in the Common Era of 284, the Emperor Diocletian did manage to restore order. And he realized that Rome had become too big, that there was no way to effectively administer this empire that, by the way, is the size of the United States. He said, there's no way. We're just too big. And so what he decided was that he would divide the empire into two parts. There would be an Eastern empire that mostly spoke Greek, centered in Constantinople in what is today Istanbul, the capital of Turkey. And there would be a Western empire, mostly spoke Latin, focused in the city of Rome. And this was a smart move, because Rome had simply grown too big for its ability to administer, for its ability to maintain any type of order and stability. So meanwhile, a few years later, the Emperor Constantine became the emperor of the Western Empire. And by this point, there is an emperor of a Western Empire, and there is an emperor of an Eastern Empire. The two are becoming effectively separate nations. And Constantine was the first to convert to Christianity. Because by 312, Christianity had been around for over 300 years, and it had grown in popularity. And so he wound up becoming the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. And he said, and I quote, "Rome is worth a mass." Now, so far we've talked about some economic problems. We've talked about some administrative problems. And then lastly, the problem of, yes ma'am?
Can you go back to the slide?
Yeah. This one right here? Yeah. Okay. So lastly, we have the problem of outside invaders. And there were, the Neolithic Revolution, the discovery of farming, is not a concrete thing. It occurred at different times in different parts of the world, and it didn't affect everyone the same. It's not that everyone went from being cavemen to living in towns and cities. It's more like some people went from being cavemen to living in towns and cities, and over time, more and more folks started living in towns and cities and becoming farmers. But there were often large nomadic groups, like the Mongols, like the Huns, and they were always on the move. And because they were always on the move, they didn't have a lot of things. They had camels, and they had horses, they had sheep. Yes, ma'am?
This is going to sound funny, but are these the same Huns that were in Mulan?
Yes.
Were they actually that kind of like savage, like monster-like?
Yeah, so the Well, in Mulan, they would have been, yeah, the Huns are just a large people group, and there's lots of different folks that make up that group. Now there's the nation of Hungary, kind of, that would have been some of them. There's some groups of Turkish ethnicity that were called the Tartars. That was just the Latin name for creatures of hell. Tartarus is the Latin word for hell, and Tartars are just demons from hell. There were the Huns. There were the Mongols. There were all these different groups that were always raiding. In fact, the last group to destroy the city of Rome, because it had actually been destroyed multiple times, the last group was a group called the Ostrogoths. So you don't have to know all these names, but what might be helpful is just these nomadic groups were attacking and were pillaging and looting. And the Roman military was under growing strain to keep up with this. In fact, Rome's best defense was the fact that they were centralized, they were united, that some random tribes could come attack, but Rome could send a legion. But where this really became a problem was a man named Attila the Hun. And so here's a trailer from a movie about him. Oh, come on. Okay, so Attila the Hun was the beginning of the end. What he managed to do was to unite all of these nomadic groups. And so now Rome sends a legion against the Huns. It's nothing. We're now talking about large numbers of nomads united as one. And at this point, the last of the Roman empires are paying bribes to their enemies to try to keep them away. They're paying ransom. They're paying tribute to other places. They're losing any independence they once had. And finally, in 476 AD, the last group to destroy Rome, the Ostrogoths, sacked the city. And from that point forward, there was no more Rome. There was always the city of Rome. There's still the city of Rome. And in fact, Rome's cultural legacy still endures. The Eastern Empire is going to continue for another 1,000 years. Those guys are doing fine right now. The Western Empire, not so much. And this is the end of the Roman Empire. So we'll talk some about their legacy tomorrow. I have one more clip I want to show you, but I'll go ahead and let you guys start working because it's a little longer. But yeah, go ahead and start working on your group stuff.